All right, so you're here because you want to really get a grasp on a complex topic, right? Like understand it inside and out without having to spend weeks poring over books and articles. Well, today we're doing a deep dive into something that's fascinating and honestly not talked about enough, desire in therapy,
hmm
but more specifically, what happens when it's a female therapist working with a male patient.
Yeah, that's a territory with so many psychological layers, isn't it? We'll be looking at how those big ideas like transference and countertransference come into play, how, our ideas about what it means to be male or female influence those dynamics, and what the unconscious mind is bringing to the whole therapeutic mix. Our main guide for this is going to be Joy Schaverien book, Desire and the Female Therapist, but we'll also be pulling in ideas from some of the big names in psychoanalysis, folks like Freud, Lacan, Jung, all of that illustrated with a really interesting case study about a guy who used art as part of his therapy.
Exactly. So in this deep dive, we're really trying to tease out those nuances of desire. I mean, both the kind that feels like, oh, attraction, and that deeper kind, almost like a maternal longing,
Yeah.
especially in this specific therapist-patient pairing. And then seeing how that all plays out in the real world, through this case study of a young man named Carlos who is dealing with anorexia and using art to help him heal.
It's about going beneath the surface of that therapeutic interaction, seeing what gets stirred up, how that impacts both the therapist and the patient, and especially how it plays out when those roles are filled by a woman and a man, respectively.
All right, so let's dig into this. The book starts off talking about desire and difference.
Mhm.
I mean, when we talk about men and women, where do these differences even come from in the first place? Are they like baked in from the beginning, or is it something we learn?
Oh, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? One perspective, and Brennan really highlights this, is that there are these core fundamental differences between men and women, like maybe rooted in biology or something. Think about all those old stereotypes. Women are more nurturing, men are more aggressive, that kind of thing. But a lot of feminist thinkers have really pushed back on those ideas.
Right, and then there's Lacan and his whole concept of the symbolic order.
Yeah.
Now, when he talks about symbolic, he's not talking about like a red light means stop, right? It's much deeper than that.
Right, exactly. It's more fundamental. For Lacan, the symbolic order is this realm of language and social structures that we enter as we develop. So it's like how we make sense of the world, how we even know we're a separate person. Imagine like the rule book for being human and interacting with other humans.
So we learn how to communicate, how to understand each other through this symbolic order. It's what allows us to have a sense of self, to be a me separate from you. And like the book points out, when that breaks down, that's when you get some serious psychological problems. So it's this ability to differentiate, which the symbolic order provides, that's really the foundation for, well, being sane.
Absolutely. And when we talk about differences between men and women, it's this symbolic construction of those differences, not just some innate thing that's important. Now, Irigaray, she adds another layer to this. And, some people might see her focus on the differences between men and women as like supporting those essentialist views. But Whitford argues that it's more nuanced than that and really important to, this dynamic we're talking about, a female therapist and a male patient.
So how so?
Yeah.
Because the book mentions Irigaray saying that women experience themselves in a way that isn't like linear or what she calls phallic.
Mm-hmm.
But she's also very clear that it's not that women are lacking something.
Exactly. She's not saying women are deficient. She's saying that their experience is just as valid, but it's different. Maybe it's not as easily captured by existing language. And Whitford says that those who see her as just an essentialist are missing her point. Her focus is on the symbolic order and how women, within that order, might experience desires and drives that don't fit neatly into the existing framework. It's not about some inherent female nature, but their specific place within that symbolic structure.
Got it. So it's the symbolic construction of difference, not just biology.
Oh.
That's the lens we have to look through, which makes sense. So let's shift gears a bit and talk specifically about erotic transference and countertransference, when you've got that female therapist, male patient dynamic.
Yeah, this is fascinating because it's actually not as well documented as, say, the reverse, male therapist, female patient, or even female therapist, female patient, which thinkers like Eichenbaum and Orbach and Chodorow have looked at. But female analysts have been writing more and more about this particular dynamic.
Right, and the book brings up that McNamara case where a female psychiatrist was accused of sexually exploiting a male patient. Why is that case so important to what we're talking about?
Well, a couple things. Firstly, the public reaction to that case was really strong, especially compared to, When similar allegations are made against male therapists, even when there's like multiple instances of abuse, it's almost like there's this deeper discomfort when it's a woman in that position of power and the patient is male.
Like, we don't expect women to violate boundaries like that.
It really raises questions about our assumptions, doesn't it? And then the McNamara case also shows how what we call maternal transference and countertransference can completely obscure those sexual feelings. In that case, the psychiatrist was allegedly writing stories for the patient, giving gifts. It really blurred those lines. And it shows that, female therapists can absolutely misuse their power and that these seemingly caring behaviors can get really tangled up with other dynamics.
And the book even mentions how often these erotic transferences are reported. It says that, according to Coolish, there are relatively few documented cases of sustained erotic transferences from men to their female therapists, which is kind of the opposite of what Feldman, Summers, and Jones found, with male analysts more often acting on those feelings.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. It could be differences in how they're experienced or how comfortable people are talking about them, or even just how these things are documented. Gutman suggests that female therapists might be more willing to discuss their own erotic countertransference.
Which is fascinating, especially because some of the most important work on countertransference in general came from female analysts like Hyman, Little, and Tower. It's almost like they were more attuned to the therapist's own inner landscape, how that impacts the work.
Right, like they were willing to really examine that as a vital part of understanding what's happening in the therapy.
Okay, so we're seeing that desire in this setting is really complicated. It's shaped by our ideas about gender, by societal expectations, and this whole interplay of transference and countertransference. Now let's get into this idea of the incest taboo and how it inevitably comes up in therapy.
But, therapy is a really intimate process, and often patients revisit earlier stages of development. So it's pretty much unavoidable that what we call incest constellations will show up, both in how the patient feels toward the therapist and vice versa, whether the therapist is the same gender or the opposite gender. And Searles points out that even in normal development, there's a point where parents kind of appreciate their child as a potential partner. But healthy development means recognizing boundaries, right? Seeing yourself as separate, letting go of those early incestuous desires.
So that intimate setting of therapy can almost reactivate those really early relational patterns, even unconsciously. And those feelings might have a sexual element, but they're also really held back by that huge taboo against incest.
Right, exactly. And that taboo plays out in different ways, as Coolish notes, sometimes leading to withdrawing from the relationship or sometimes even more intensely connecting. Jung connects this whole transference, countertransference thing to this idea of a kinship libido and even to like cross-cousin marriage in anthropology. So maybe there's something deeper going on, more archetypal.
The book also brings up Jessica Smirgel's ideas about how early sexuality is different for boys and girls. How does that fit into all of this?
Well, she says that for boys, there can be this early fantasy of being a powerful partner for the mother, like even having children with her. And if the father isn't around or is weak, this seductive mother, as she calls it, can reinforce that early sense of potency. But it can really mess with the guy's ability to have healthy relationships with women later on, keeping him stuck at that early stage.
And then there's this really intense fear, like a fear of death tied to the desire for the mother, this idea of being sucked back into the womb, as the book puts it.
Yeah, that's a primal fear, like being totally engulfed, losing your individual self. And Stoller links this to a fear of femininity and even a potential loss of masculinity. So for men, separating from that early identification with the mother is crucial. And Shasaquat says the father plays a big role in that.
So the father's presence or absence has a huge impact on how these early incestuous feelings play out and how they might show up later in life, like in therapy. Okay, let's dive into this case study of Carlos. It sounds like a really powerful example of these dynamics in action.
Yeah, it is. So Carlos was a 23-year-old inpatient dealing with anorexia. It's actually way less common in men, and it's often seen as this defense against growing up. And what makes his case so interesting is that art therapy was a big part of his treatment, so we get to see into his inner world in this unique way.
Okay, so we learned that he was the oldest of 6 kids, born in South America, spent his early years basically surrounded by women. His mom and her sisters. Then he moved to the States with his mom and stepfather, but he knew his biological father as a family friend.
So that early environment, with all those women, plus the ambiguous role of his biological father, that all seems to have shaped him. The book mentions that he was kind of ambivalent about sex, had some homosexual fantasies, so it seems like he had a complicated relationship with his own masculinity.
And it seems like his libido, that basic life force, was so focused on his mother. There's a quote from Jung about the strange idea of becoming a child again, returning to the parental shelter and entering into the mother to be reborn through her, which the book is careful to point out is meant symbolically, not literally.
Right, of course. But for Carlos, it had a real impact on his life. He was almost completely dependent on his mom before being hospitalized. And there's this psychodrama he did where he literally felt held back by an elastic band attached to his mother every time he tried to connect with someone else.
Wow. The book also mentions Kristeva's idea of matricide as being necessary for, becoming a separate person. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so Kristeva argues that for both men and women, you have to symbolically kill off the mother, meaning you have to let go of that early, all-encompassing bond to become an individual. It's not literal, of course. It's about separating yourself from her influence so you can have other attachments, develop your own identity. And in Carlos's case, his mother actually died unexpectedly before he'd really worked through that.
And then right after she died and after he had his first sexual experience with a woman friend, he abruptly quit therapy. What does the book say about why that might have happened?
Well, there are a few possibilities. Maybe her death, in a weird way, freed him, and the relationship with his friend gave him somewhere else to direct those dependency needs. But the book also suggests that he might have unconsciously seen the therapist as another mother figure, like he had to leave therapy to be with this woman. And the therapist's own feelings, like feeling abandoned and wanting to keep him in therapy, that also adds to the whole dynamic.
So there was this really intense, almost primal thing happening in the transference from the very beginning.
Oh, definitely. And that underlying incestuous element was very strong.
Now let's talk about the art therapy. How did working with art help Carlos work through these really deep issues?
Well, art therapy gave him this way to access stuff he couldn't put into words. The book calls it visual interpretation, a way to express those emotions and conflicts that were too difficult to talk about directly. His very first picture was just these bubbles, and it seemed to represent, his struggles and this yearning for something better.
The book also talks about scapegoat transference when it comes to his art. What does that mean?
It's like his pictures took on these aspects of himself, his anxieties, desires, all that. The art became a stand-in for his inner world, something tangible he could work with, which can be really helpful because it lets a patient engage with those difficult parts of themselves in a way that's more concrete. Often that's necessary before they can really process it all symbolically.
And the book goes into a lot of detail about some of his most important pictures. Let's touch on a few. There's the bubble, which he drew pretty early on.
Right. The bubble shows this figure that's almost lifeless, androgynous, trapped inside a bubble. And it seems like a regression to this very early state, almost like before birth, like retreating into this womb where nothing can hurt him. Jung's idea that a regressed libido can bring up those early parental images and lead to either psychological death or self-mutilation is really relevant here. The lack of sexual characteristics, plus the whole self-starvation thing in anorexia, makes you think.
And then there's the candle. What did that one seem to represent?
The candle, with its shape and the light it gives off, that seemed to be about emerging masculinity and awareness of desire, but still kind of fragile, like the cobwebs in the drawing.
There's also the picture he drew of his mother, just titled Mother. What was that about?
That one was very idealized, almost saintly, what you might call a Madonna figure. And he realized afterward how much he'd put her on a pedestal, seen her as perfect, which no one is, of course. And the cobwebs in that one suggested things that were hidden or unexplored, probably connected to that whole maternal aspect of his psyche.
And the family picture, that was a key one too, especially after we learned about his biological father. How did that new information change the way we understand that artwork?
Yeah, at first, those lines in the family picture looked like rays of light coming from the mother, like she was the center, the source of everything. But after he learned about his real father, he saw those lines as bars, with the mother holding the key, which really shows that incestuous hold that was created by that secret.
And then there are all those other pictures, like birth, tree and ghost, tree and pyramids, reflection. It's like they're showing his progress towards separation and becoming his own person.
Exactly. Birth showed him still fused with his mother. Tree and Ghosts was all about that fear and isolation, the depression that comes with being alone. Tree and pyramids showed a bit of separation from the mother and a longing for independence, like those pyramids standing strong on their own. And then reflection, where he started drawing himself looking in mirrors, that's a big step toward differentiation. It reminds you of Lacan's mirror stage, where a child recognizes their own image as separate.
So the later pictures, like the battle, Mother Witch, the dragon, the sun, those seem to show him actively engaging with his conflicts and becoming more whole.
Yeah, the battle was literally about him fighting to break free from his mother's influence, maybe projecting some of that onto the hospital staff, seeing them as persecutors. Mother Witch was confronting that negative internal image of his mother. The dragon was about conquering his anorexia, and the sun was about integrating his conscious and unconscious, like letting the light in.
So it's like through his art, you see him moving from that regressed, dependent state to a more hopeful, engaged place.
Yeah.
Like moving from what Lacan called the imaginary to the symbolic.
Exactly. And it's important to note the therapist's own experience through all of this. She talks about genuinely liking him and how her feelings shifted from that almost maternal caregiving to something more complicated, with those Oedipal feelings, even aggression. Being in that close environment of the inpatient unit probably intensified everything too.
Now, the book gets into this interesting idea of aesthetic countertransference and the role of the gaze in art therapy. Can you unpack that for us?
So aesthetic countertransference is about the therapist's own reactions to the artwork itself, the colors, the composition, all of it. And it happens because those images can tap into deep, maybe even unconscious stuff, maybe even those universal archetypal images. Art psychotherapy is really this three-way relationship. Artist, artwork, therapist. You've got that direct relationship between the artist and what they create, and then the therapist is brought into it. And it's like Wittgenstein's duck rabbit,
Right.
where the way you see an image can totally shift.
Right, right. And then there's that distinction between diagrammatic and embodied images.
Yeah, so diagrammatic images, those are like illustrations of something already known. But embodied images, those resonate on a deeper level. They tap into that gap that Lacan talks about. They reveal something new. And the act of creating art, that was a form of mirroring for Carlos. At first, it was like transference with the therapist, but then it became more internal.
The book mentions those ancient beliefs about mirrors and images, like they hold part of your soul. And then it brings up Narcissus. How did those things connect to what was happening with Carlos?
Well, those old beliefs, they show how powerful and maybe even scary that link between image and self is. And Narcissus, falling in love with his reflection, that's about being too invested in your image, projecting that onto others. And in therapy, the images can be like a mirror, challenging the person to really see themselves. The artwork has the artist's desire in it. It pulls both the artist and the therapist into this relationship with the self, through looking, through the gaze.
And there's a difference between like physically seeing with your eyes
Yeah.
and this idea of the gaze, right?
Right. The eye is that conscious act of looking, but the gaze is more unconscious. And the aesthetic countertransference, that's partly the therapist's unconscious response to the artwork. And even the artist looking at their own work, that can be powerful too. Pictures can become like talismans, connecting back to this less differentiated state.
And the book brings up that bubble picture again, saying that something doesn't have to be traditionally beautiful to grab you, to evoke those feelings. It mentions Kant and beyond.
Right, even something disturbing can make you want to understand it. And the book ends that section talking about how important this case study is for understanding male anorexia. It's something that needs more attention.
Okay, so to sum up, we've covered a lot here. We've explored desire, transference, countertransference, specifically with a female therapist and a male patient, how that symbolic order shapes how we see gender, and how that incest taboo is always there, influencing relationships. And then Carlos's story and his art therapy show how powerful art can be for healing.
Yeah, his art really became his way of communicating, of facing those deep conflicts and starting to become a more whole person.
It really gets you thinking, doesn't it? About the desires and projections that are probably happening in all our relationships, not just therapy. And maybe understanding those things can help us be more self-aware, more connected to others. I mean, it makes me want to learn more about the people we talked about and art therapy in general.
Yeah, there's always more to learn. The human psyche is endlessly fascinating.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. Hopefully it gave you some things to think about, maybe even sparked your curiosity to explore some of this stuff on your own.